experience. They should have known that the few civil defence units, old men and young boys, could not stop the Russian tanks, and if those tanks turned around at the first indication of resistance, it was by no means a sign of victory by the civil defence or of the Hitler Youth. It only meant that it was a reconnaissance unit that was not supposed to fight, but to find out what was opposing them. We received news that SS Group Steiner, which was supposed to break through to Berlin from Oranienburg, had been repulsed and driven back to its initial positions. The offensive of Wenck's 12th Army was supposed to have begun from the area of Wittenberg, but it had not begun to have any impact yet. Early in the morning on April 25th, Weidling and I drove to the Berlin Military Command at Hohenzollern-Damm in Wilmersdorf, a southwestern suburb of Berlin about 5 kilometers from the Reich Chancellery. The Berlin Military Command was just like a corps staff. It was a big operation, with a peacetime staff of about 300, including many telephone operators, now mostly women. When we took over, therefore, all our positions existed in duplicate. The Berlin Military Command's Chief of Staff was Oberstleutnant I.G. Refior, an old acquaintance of General Weidling's. Weidling decided to keep both Chiefs of Staff, von Dufing for fighting and tactical matters, and Refior, who knew everyone in both the political and military command structures in Berlin and knew how to get things done, for political matters. The Berlin Military Command's operations officer, Major I.G. Sprotte, made a bad first impression on Weidling, who dispatched him to Potsdam. Sprotte, not in the least disappointed, was in a big hurry to get out of Berlin anyway. To turn everything over to me in an orderly manner would have taken several days, so he showed me his maps and drawings with a sweep of his hand, and promptly disappeared. With that, I was sitting alone in a room with 3 telephones that rang constantly. When I realized after 3 phone calls that they were all from offices of city, party or ministry authorities who were calling to get information about the military situation, I took all 3 phones off the hook so I could get my work done. We had to act quickly now to distribute our 5 division staffs in such a way that each of them got 2 to 4 defence sectors, so we would have all around the city a firm skeleton of experienced combat officers, whom we knew and who knew us. Then, as quickly as possible, we had to establish a secure military communications network. It was impossible to continue to lead our troops via the public telephone network. Life here now became like a typical day in combat, constant crises. When I could sleep 2 hours in a row, I was lucky. In addition to all the crises, I had to coordinate all the reports from the field. They would come to me by telephone, and I had to prepare a daily report at night that summarized all the telephone reports I had received during the day. Since the artillery shelling and the bombing strikes were becoming more and more frequent, we moved into the basement shortly after we moved into this building. Again, we found some of the rooms to be filled with food, coffee, liquor, even wristwatches. All military personnel in Berlin, except the SS troops that guarded Führer headquarters under SS General Mohnke, were now under Weidling's command. The army, the Hitler Youth, the Volkssturm, the anti-aircraft crews, the convalescent battalions from hospitals, and so forth. We had our own 4 divisions. The 5th one, the 20th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, had disappeared to the west, apparently to surrender there. In its sector, each division took command of whatever Hitler Youth and Volkssturm happened to be there. After a day or so, we had a defence that could hope to resist the Russians at least for a little while. We did not have long to wait. The disappearance of the 20th SS Panzer Grenadier Division left a gap, and the Russians soon drove a wedge through it. By now, we could see the infantry fighting from our building. During the evening, I entered a room where Weidling was meeting with both von Dufing and Refior. They were discussing whether to defend Berlin dutifully, or whether it would be appropriate to stay here and let the Russians pass by on both sides of us, and then break through the Grunewald, woods to the west of the city, escape to the west, and surrender to the Western Allies. If we stayed to defend Berlin, it would be necessary to move our headquarters to the centre of the city, because within 2 days at the latest, the Russians would be occupying this building. Weidling then made his decision to stay and defend Berlin. The night was extremely turbulent. Outside we could hear the sounds of combat nearby. Major Wolff and his counterpart on the Berlin Military Command Staff, Hauptmann Burenbeck, had organised the immediate defence of the building. I returned early in the morning of April 26th to the second-floor office I had occupied before we moved into the basement. There were continuous artillery bursts all around, and I could see hand-to-hand fighting in the garden parcels to the south. We were obviously in a very dangerous position. Weidling decided to move Corps headquarters to a big anti-aircraft bunker near the Berlin Zoo. I was quite glad to be ordered to go to the air raid shelter bunker at the zoo, with Major Wolff as an advance party to establish our new headquarters. Major Wolff and I made our way to the zoo bunker separately to try to ensure that one of us would get there. The zoo bunker, a heavily fortified place with heavy anti-aircraft guns on the roof, would be safe against bombing and artillery. Flakturm Tiergarten Flak Tower, or commonly referred to as the Zoo Tower. I was accompanied by a driver and a motorcycle runner. When we left our headquarters, we had to be careful, because the railroad embankment behind our building was under fire, and we had to cross it to get to our Kübelwagen and motorcycle. We crossed it by dashing from cover to cover, finally arriving safely at our vehicles. As we drove through the city, the earth trembled with each exploding artillery shell, and a huge geyser of earth and debris erupted from the ground with each explosion. The noise was deafening, and the heaving of the earth was unsettling. A sliver of shrapnel from an exploding artillery shell finally punctured one of the tyres on my Kübelwagen. While my driver was changing the tyre, a woman watching from a house nearby offered me a cup of tea. She was about 45 years old and matronly, with worn clothes, bedraggled hair, and a kind face. She was the wife of a Feldwebel and the mother of a Gefreiter, and she had no idea what had happened to either of them. Apparently my lack of personal care showed, and she asked if I would like to wash up as well, so after several days I was able to experience the luxury of washing. I greatly appreciated her generosity, especially since many civilians were understandably beginning to turn against the army for defending the city instead of surrendering it. Her apartment was in shambles from the artillery blasts. Small knickknacks, little pieces of her life, lay shattered on the floor about her. "When will the Russians arrive, Herr Major?" she asked. "In a matter of hours," I told her honestly. "A day at most. You will be safest if you stay in your basement." Parts of Berlin were a virtual junkyard of disabled military equipment, and the smell of death now permeated everything. In addition to human corpses, many of the animals from the zoo had escaped and been killed. I arrived at the zoo bunker at about noon and found that Wolff had already arrived. There was a big flak bunker at the zoo, 7 or 8 stories high, with 6 big 128mm and 6 20mm anti-aircraft guns on its roof. The bunker could house 600 people. Every room was occupied, so we selected those we would need and told their occupants they would have to leave because the rooms were needed by the commanding general of the Berlin Military Command. Several of the rooms had been reserved as a private refuge for Goebbels because the place was so safe from attack. I did not attempt to dispossess Goebbels, of course, but I took over the offices of other superfluous staffs. I sent Major Wolff back with the information that rooms had been assigned and that the communications officer should come to see to the appropriate telephone connections. After Wolff had gone, I put up signs directing the various units of our corps staff to their assigned rooms. When I had done everything I could do, it was late at night, and I lay down to rest, having had very little rest or sleep in a long time. Every half hour or so a bomb would hit the building. The building would sway visibly, the lights would flicker out momentarily, and a fine spray of plaster would descend from the ceiling. But the building was completely safe because the walls were several meters thick and bombs could not penetrate them. In my state of exhaustion, the motion of the giant bunker swaying on the marshy soil of the Tiergarten Park only helped put me to sleep. When I woke after a few hours and the staff had still not arrived, I began to wonder if perhaps they had decided to leave through the Grunewald after all. Since I could not reach anyone by telephone, I decided to take advantage of the situation and get a full night's sleep for a change. There was nothing I could do anyway. Finally, the next morning, Wolf returned with the news that Weidling had decided to move instead to the old headquarters of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces. It was closer to Führer headquarters and it had direct telephone lines to it. Because it was located on Bendlerstrasse, everyone in the army referred to it as Bendlerstrasse. It had been a full city block of buildings, but everything except the basements had by now been pretty much destroyed. In the centre of the huge courtyard was a large bunker, 3 or 4 stories high, which was safe against the most formidable bombs, just like the zoo bunker. It was used as the communications centre not only for the army in Berlin, but also for Führer headquarters. When I arrived there, our staff had been established in the basement. The actual working headquarters of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces was no longer in Berlin. It had moved out of Berlin when the Allies began to bomb the city on a regular basis. By the time we moved in, the place had been almost abandoned except for civilians living in the basements. Our staff had already been at work there since midnight. I found Refior at his desk with coffee, cognac, asparagus tips, and ham. Von Duving was working on a plan to break out of Berlin to the northwest, across the Pischelsdorf Bridge. I joined him and helped put together the time calculations and the distribution of our forces. I also drew the necessary maps for the operation. General Weidling was in a room in which we were told Count von Stauffenberg and some other officers had been shot following the July 20th, 1944, attempt to assassinate Hitler. It was chilling to see the bullet holes in the wall. It occurred to me that Germany would probably not be enduring this terrible final battle if von Stauffenberg had succeeded. At noon, I had to leave to take the city map with the current military situation to Führer headquarters. It had become very dangerous outside, with shell bursts everywhere. The acrid smell of smoke mingled with the stench of decomposing corpses. Dust from pulverized bricks and plaster rose over the city like a heavy fog. The streets, littered with rubble and pockmarked with huge craters, were deserted. I had to be careful not to get entangled in the streetcar wires dangling everywhere. At the Reich Chancellery, my identification card, signed by Goebbels personally so I could get quick access to the bunker, secured entrance for me. To get to the actual Führer headquarters, I had to show another identification card signed by Johann Meyer, army adjutant to Hitler. Then I had to surrender my pistol, and finally I was admitted to the antechamber, which was furnished with green leather chairs along the walls. Such fine furniture seemed out of place in a concrete bunker deep under the ground. I thought I remembered the green chairs from my visit at the Chancellery 6 years earlier. Martin Bormann, who was sitting in the antechamber, immediately jumped at me and asked what I wanted. I told him I was bringing the latest situation map. I wanted to go to Krebs immediately, but Bormann insisted that I have soda and cookies while he pumped me with a lot of questions concerning the situation outside and what I thought about it. Bormann was about 50 years old, short and heavy, with a broad nose punctuating a round face that sat atop a bull neck. As political chief of staff to the Führer, he determined who was and was not admitted to see Hitler. In Krebs's antechamber I met Weiss and Freitag Löringhoff, aides to General Burgdorf, and gave them the situation map. In turn, I copied the overall situation from their map. According to it, Wenck's 12th Army had begun its attack on April 25th and had progressed well in the beginning. Today, however, Wenck had been able to proceed no farther than the Belitz State Hospital and was engaged in heavy fighting with Soviet troops who had attacked it from the east. Nobody here in the map room of the Chief of Staff of the Army really believed any longer that Berlin would be relieved. I learned when I returned to our bunker that Göring had been arrested for attempting to replace Hitler as Führer, and that Hitler had ordered Himmler's arrest for attempting to negotiate with the Allies. The government was disintegrating as rapidly as the military situation. but Hitler was apparently determined to fight to the last possible moment, no matter how many lives it cost or how much destruction to the city. Interestingly, the Reich Chancellery did not have a large radio transmitter. All messages had to go through our communications centre in the bunker of the old headquarters of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, so we knew what was happening everywhere. From Führer headquarters, only a telephone connection of the public telephone network existed, and it was now being interrupted constantly by the fighting. We had laid 4 military cables to Vossstrasse, where the Reich Chancellery was located, of which only one was still occasionally operational, even though we had men working constantly to keep the lines in service. For that reason, I always had to make the trip myself whenever something important came up. The trip was becoming increasingly dangerous because at some places Russian shock troops had already crossed the Landwehr Canal and were located in some of the houses at Matthias Churchyard and in the vicinity of the Hotel Esplanade. All the buildings in this area had basements, and people were living in them. There was food in the buildings. Many things had been stored in these buildings, because this had been the headquarters of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces. There was even cognac and other things that were very scarce for civilians. The army had obviously prepared to take care of itself. During the day, either von Dufing or I stayed in close contact with our divisions by telephone or radio, and of course each night I prepared a consolidated report from the division's reports. In addition, I made at least one daily trip to Führer headquarters to report, not only because our lines were constantly being destroyed by artillery fire, but because we could never be sure that the Russians were not listening in. One of the worst things about the defence of Berlin was that the Russians always had fresh reserves to put into the fighting, so they could rest their troops, but our people had to just keep fighting, hour after hour and day after day, until they were killed or seriously wounded. There was no such thing as a typical day. Sometimes the Russians would hit us at 3 in the morning, sometimes at 6, and the day just unfolded from there. Our time was spent responding to crises that incessantly occurred. I would get reports from the divisions. I would get cries for help. I was constantly involved, solving logistical problems, receiving and compiling reports, and informing the divisions of new developments. General Weidling was always out visiting the divisions, going where things were worst to get his own view of each situation in person, and von Dufing was directing the fighting from Corps headquarters. We all caught a few moments' rest whenever work permitted. I learned that I had to stand up whenever I was wakened to take a telephone call. Several times I took a call that woke me, listened to the problem of the caller, gave instructions to handle the situation, and then went back to sleep. Then, when I woke, I had no recollection of the conversation and did not know I had given such orders, although eventually I would remember it. After that, I put the telephone far enough away that I would have to stand up to answer it. I had to report the decisions I made to the Chief of Staff and to the Commanding General, so it was essential that I remember what I had done. I spent a lot of my time now going back and forth between Führer headquarters and our Corps headquarters on Bendlerstrasse. There were hardly any buildings remaining in the neighbourhood, and even those that still stood were badly damaged and nearly unrecognisable, although most of the basements were still usable. The whole area was in ruins, having been bombed earlier in British and American air raids, and now shelled by Russian artillery. Artillery shells exploded continuously, with thundering detonations. When I went outside now, the smoke from the burning city sliced through my nostrils and lungs like a jagged blade edge. The streets were full of both debris and bodies, although the bodies were hardly recognisable as such. The corpses of both soldiers and civilians who had been killed in the shelling and bombing were under debris, and everything was covered with a grey and red powder from the destruction of the buildings. The stink of death was suffocating. We had no way to dispose of the bodies, or even to collect them, because we were under constant air and artillery bombardment, and infantry fighting was now everywhere. The city smelled like a battlefield, which in fact it was, with the smell of the plaster and brick dust from disintegrating buildings, of burning wood, of burned gunpowder, of gasoline, and of decomposing corpses. Fortunately, the nights were still cool, so the smell of death was still just bearable. When I made the trip to Führer headquarters now, approximately 1 kilometre, I had to dart from cover to cover, watching not only for incoming artillery rounds, but for rifle and machine gun fire as well. From our command bunker, I went straight up Bendlerstrasse to the Tiergarten, then along the south side of the park or through it. The Russians were already in parts of the park, and they fired at all movement. Then onto the southwest corner of the Reich Chancellery across from the park, I would enter the bunker from the basement of the Chancellery. Some of the SS troops defending the Chancellery were dug in before the building. At night, both sides would shoot at any movement. To the people at Führer headquarters, we represented the outside world. Nobody there had left the bunker for several days. They were safe in the bunker, with its many feet of concrete under many feet of earth, but they did not know what was going on outside, that the fighting was only a kilometre away, or that the rescuing armies had been halted. Hitler and the High Command were juggling divisions that no longer existed, or were just skeletons of themselves. Every time I came into the bunker, Martin Bormann especially was eager to know what was happening. He was always there, in the big antechamber in front of Hitler's office and living quarters. Every time I came in, he would insist that I sit down on one of the green leather chairs and have some of his goodies and tell him about the situation on the outside. It was very important to him to know the situation on the outside before anyone else did. As a civilian chief of staff to Hitler, he had a reputation for being a ruthless intriguer. Everyone knew his power, and everyone had a certain fear of him because he had constant access to Hitler, but he was not held in high esteem by military leaders. The effort to supply us by air had practically ceased, since the east-west axis, the parade avenue through the Tiergarten, was now under constant mortar fire. The last plane that had landed did not make it off the ground again and was still sitting there, crippled by enemy fire. It was impossible to land ammunition for 50,000 men, let alone to parachute it in. The airdrops had produced only 6 tons of supplies. Above all, there was no way to distribute them to the troops. The situation was such that we still had control of an area shaped like a dumbbell. In the east, we had an area about 3 kilometres in diameter, with the Reich Chancellery in the centre. The shaft of the dumbbell was the Heerstrasse, about 8 kilometres long, which was being crossed from time to time by Russian tanks. In spite of that, the subway tunnel under it was still a safe connection to the west, where we still controlled an area about 3 kilometres in diameter surrounding the Olympic Stadium. The fighting out there was being done by the Hitler Youth, who, with exceptional courage, were keeping open the Pichelsdorf Bridge for a possible breakout to the west. The main push of the Russians was directed toward the centre of Berlin, which they had attacked from the south, east and north. For some reason, they had not hit upon the simple idea of attacking along the Heerstrasse, which they could reach without much effort, moving cast and just driving through the Brandenburg Gate into the centre of the city. The city's defenders, the remnants of our 56th Panzer Corps and General Monke's 1,000 SS troops defending Führer headquarters, were red-eyed and sleepless, living in a world of fire, smoke, death and horror. Much of Berlin was burning like a bonfire. The fighting was being shared by soldiers and civilians alike. When the shelling got bad, the women queuing up for water would press closer to the building walls to hold their places in line. Since such a front could not possibly be held for more than a few days, Weidling decided to make a determined plea to Hitler to break out as long as the route to and across the Pichelsdorf Bridge remained open. Once again, von Duffing and I went over the plan to break out of Berlin to the west and northwest, across the Pichelsdorf Bridge. We worked through the night, preparing the necessary orders and issuing them to the divisions. Only the codename Spring Storm was necessary to set everything in motion. Our plan to break out in 3 groups promised real safety for Hitler and the other occupants of Führer headquarters. A group of SS shock troops with about a dozen self-propelled guns would open the way. The 25 or so tanks that were still operational would surround the armoured personnel carriers containing Hitler and his entourage to provide flank protection, and the infantry now fighting the Russians in the eastern sectors of Berlin would provide the rear guard. The plan was to start at midnight and be out of the city by morning. We had broken out of encirclement before in Silesia, and we knew that those riding in armoured personnel carriers in the centre of such a fighting force would get through safely. Once out of Berlin, we would have to march for a few days to the northwest toward Lübeck. The Russian Air Force was not a big threat because it was not very efficient, although it would certainly lob some bombs at us. At about noon, General Weidling and I took the maps and departed for Führer headquarters. Outside, conditions were more dangerous than ever. Since morning, the Russians had held the Liechtenstein Bridge, and before the day was over, the entire Tiergarten would be in Russian hands. Russian artillery shells were exploding everywhere, causing the earth to tremble and sending dirt, pavement, bricks and other debris high into the air to fail back to earth and injure anyone below. The roar of flames from burning buildings and the crunching sound of falling walls were terrifying. We dashed from doorway to doorway in short bursts to avoid not only shrapnel and other debris from the artillery shells, but also rifle and machine gun fire. At 28, I did not find the running especially strenuous. At 57, General Weidling had a more difficult time. We no longer had to surrender our pistols at Führer headquarters because we were so well known. When we arrived at Hitler's headquarters several flights of stairs below ground level, the situation briefing had just begun. General Weidling was announced to Hitler and immediately admitted to the briefing room. I waited in the large outer chamber with detailed maps that Weidling might need. The bunker smelled damp, and the sound of the small engine that ran the exhaust system provided a constant background noise. The ever-present Martin Bormann accosted me again. I had one of Bormann's sandwiches and filled him in on the battle that was being waged above ground. After about 45 minutes, the meeting in the briefing room ended. Hitler emerged, followed by Dr. Goebbels, General Krebs, General Weidling and some other people. I saluted, and Hitler walked toward me. As he neared, I was shocked by his appearance. He was stooped, and his left arm was bent and shaking. Half of his face drooped, as if he'd had a stroke, and his facial muscles on that side no longer worked. Both of his hands shook, and one eye was swollen. He looked like a very old man, at least 20 years older than his 56 years. Weidling presented me to Hitler. Major Knapper, my operations officer. Hitler shook my hand and said, "Weidling has told me what you are going through. You have been having a bad time of it." Being accustomed to saying "Jawohl, Herr General," I automatically said "Jawohl, Herr." And then, realizing that this was wrong, I quickly corrected to "Jawohl, mein Führer." Hitler smiled faintly, and Goebbels smiled broadly, but Weidling frowned because his subordinate had made a social error. Hitler said goodbye, shook my hand again, and disappeared in the general direction of Goebbels's quarters. Although his behaviour had not been lethargic, his appearance had been pitiful. Hitler was now hardly more than a physical caricature of what he had been. I wondered how it was possible that in only 6 years, this idol of my whole generation of young people could have become such a human wreck. It occurred to me then that Hitler was still the living symbol of Germany, but Germany as it was now. In the same 6 years, the flourishing, aspiring country had become a flaming pile of debris and ruin. Weidling and I left the bunker through the basement hallways of the Reich Chancellery. We had found a safe passage through the basement all the way to a window facing Hermann-Göring-Strasse. "Did he approve the plan?" I asked with trepidation. "No," Weidling said angrily, "but it was the way he did it." This man whom I had seen remain calm under even the most adverse circumstances was so furious that his voice quivered. He listened to my proposal, and then he said, "No, Weidling, I do not want to risk dying in the streets like a dog. Our soldiers have been dying in the streets of Europe for the past 6 years at his command. For him to imply now that such a death is somehow dishonourable is loathsome." Weidling was so angry that he was throwing caution to the wind. If someone had overheard and reported what he had just said to me, his life would have been in very great danger. But our men had been dying in the streets of Berlin every day and every night since we had arrived in the city, and they had died in the streets of other cities before Berlin. For Hitler to be so disrespectful toward the men who were sacrificing their own lives every day just to keep him alive one more day filled me with anger also. Many men who had served under my command had died since the beginning of the war. My own brother had died for Führer and fatherland. No wonder Weidling was angry. We had both been in the war from the beginning, and we had both seen countless deaths in our almost 6 years of war. As soldiers, we had accepted death, even our own, if it came as a natural part of our lives. We accepted it as a price we had to pay for a cause we had thought just, at least in the beginning. We were perhaps only now, at the last possible moment, beginning to see clearly what kind of man we had been following. When I reported to the Führer bunker the next day with the daily situation map and saw Hitler going from one room to another in the bunker, my hand moved involuntarily toward my pistol. I had a terribly strong urge to kill him and stop all the suffering. It would have been easy to do, since he had no personal bodyguards inside the bunker. I would not have got out alive, since SS guards were at all the entrances and exits, but I could easily have killed him. Certainly it was not fear of death that stopped the movement of my hand to my pistol. With the escape plan out of the question, my fate was sealed and unavoidable. The Russians had been shooting captured German officers following every battle in their march across Germany. My life would undoubtedly be over in a few days, in any case. In the instant I had to make a decision, I must have instinctively concluded that I should not risk making a martyr of Hitler and possibly creating another Dolchstoßlegende, stab-in-the-back myth. By late April, we no longer had any chance of defending Berlin. The horrible, hopeless battles in the streets continued, but our divisions were little more than battalions. Our morale was poor, and our ammunition was almost gone. Theoretically, we had 4 divisions with which to defend the city, but in fact the divisions were at less than half strength, and that included many wounded. By including Hitler Youth and Volkssturm, we may have had enough bodies to man 4 full divisions, but the Volkssturm was staffed by old men, and the Hitler Youth was composed of children, although some Hitler Youth were somewhat effective in defensive positions. Even if we'd had 4 fully staffed, experienced and rested divisions, we were still a corps fighting 2 army groups. And on top of everything else, we knew we would receive no more ammunition. Being outdoors in the city was becoming more dangerous, because Russian tanks were now driving around the city, German tank hunter groups were chasing them with Panzerfausts, and both were shooting wildly in all directions. To go any place in the city now meant darting from cover to cover, from doorway to doorway, climbing over and around the piles of debris and the decomposing bodies that littered the streets. When a soldier walks over and around, and sometimes inadvertently on human corpses daily, his sensibilities start to numb. I was beginning to wonder if we could still be called human. The loud roar of combat filled our days and our nights. We could usually detect from the sound what kinds of weapons were being fired. Mortars sounded slow, artillery shells were a little faster, and heavy artillery was much faster. Of course, the detonation of heavy artillery was much louder than that of light artillery and mortars. We could also tell the direction a shell was coming from by its sound, and we could tell by the sound whether it would pass over our heads or hit in our vicinity. After a while, our senses were automatically tuned to these sounds, and our reactions became instinctive. We still had not given up on the idea of breaking out of Berlin. It was obvious that a breakout could succeed only as long as we could get to the Pichelsdorf Bridge without heavy fighting. The divisions urged us to begin the breakout soon. The morale of the men leaped when they learned about the possibility of a breakout. Weidling kept urging Krebs to press Hitler on the subject, but Krebs said that Hitler could not be made to change his mind. Hitler's refusal frittered away precious hours and days, while the Russians constantly reinforced the ring around Berlin, especially to the west of the city. April 29th. The Russians were less than 500 meters from the Reich Chancellery. I could hardly steal a full hour of sleep. There was always work, reports to receive and consolidate, orders to write, instructions to give, maps and sketches to draw, phone calls to take and make, and endless other details to take care of. We learned that Wenck's 12th Army had been beaten back conclusively, and with that, any hope for a military change was gone. Everybody now wanted to place hope in a political change brought about by increasing friction between the Western Allies and the Russians. But could that be of any help to us at this point, even if it happened? Weiss, Freytag Löringhoff, and Bolt answered this question in the negative when they left the sinking ship during the afternoon, through the subway tunnel and across Lake Wannsee, to carry Hitler's last will and testament out of Berlin. However, they did not mention anything about their plans to me, even though I talked with them daily. I learned about their departure only after they had gone. At Bendlerstrasse, individual members of the staff who had no immediate job to do were having parties, dancing on the volcano, so to speak, with the women auxiliaries for signal duties. It was a relief to me to again submerge myself in my work. In another area, a feverish activity developed. Everybody wanted to take advantage of being so close to the personnel department of the Supreme Command of the Army to get bigger decorations and even a promotion. Von Dufing was promoted to Oberst at this time, and he surely had earned it. But other promotions were given very generously now at the last moment. Decorations, too, were processed rather quickly if they were related to bravery in the fight for Berlin. Several times I saw 14- and 15-year-old Hitler Youth members pick up their Iron Crosses for destroying Russian tanks. Weidling was considering trying the breakout on his own if Führer headquarters did not want to come along. It was a difficult decision for him to make, however, and he could not quite come to grips with it. We had almost given up any hope of getting out of the rubble and debris that was now Berlin, when suddenly on the morning of April 30th a call came from Führer headquarters. One of the cables actually was functioning for a change, requesting that I come over immediately and report again about the time calculations of the breakout plan. I left immediately. Through the springtime foliage of the Tiergarten, the shells burst without interruption, destroying everything in their immediate vicinity, and small arms fire was everywhere. Blinding sunshine lay over a gruesome scene. On the lawns of the Tiergarten, under mutilated age-old trees, I could recognize artillery pieces, all put out of action by direct hits. The gunners who had not made it were lying around, so mutilated they were hardly recognizable as human remains. Everywhere in the streets, the dead were visible among the piles of dust-covered debris. Empty shoes lay here and there. I remembered the first combat dead I had seen in France so long ago, and how shocked I had been at the sight. Now my sensibilities were so numb that a corpse was little more than an obstacle to step over. In those moments when I paused to catch my breath or to let a salvo of artillery shells get over with, I could see in gruesome detail the outlines of a human torso, or part of one, between fragments of bricks, rocks, and concrete. However, I could not let such observations distract me. I had to try to get in one piece across Hermann-Göring-Strasse with my papers. Maybe Hitler had decided after all to make the breakout. This time I did not have to endure Bormann's courtesies. General Krebs was waiting for me in the Führer's conference room. I laid out my maps and made another presentation on our intended breakout. Krebs then asked a lot of questions about the details of our time calculations. He was especially interested in the amount of advance notice that had to be given to the divisions before the beginning of the operation. I told him that we had everything prepared so that we could start tonight if the order went out this very moment, but that 14 hours of start-up time was required. A quick decision was necessary if the breakout was to be successful. Tomorrow night could be too late. Krebs indicated that Hitler was still opposed to a breakout, but Krebs wanted to try again to change his mind. We would hear from him about the results, so all our hope had been for nothing. He had not even approached Hitler about it. With a very heavy heart I returned to Bendlerstrasse. The hours went by without anything happening, without word from Führer headquarters to dispatch the code name to put the divisions in motion. Then it was noon for tonight, it was now too late. And tomorrow, perhaps, it would be too late altogether. Still, the front was holding firmly almost inexplicably. Why did the Russians insist on attacking at all the most difficult places? Across the Spree River at the Charité Hospital and across the Landwehr Canal at the Lotzerufer, at Potsdam Square and in Leipziger Strasse, where General Monke's SS units defended the immediate surroundings of the Reich Chancellery. The Russians apparently wanted to conquer the Reichstag and the Reich Chancellery as quickly as possible. It was lucky they did not know that the easiest way would have led them very quickly and directly to their goal. Each time I drew a new situation map, it was a puzzle to me why the Russian General Staff could not recognize that. During April 30th, the Russians captured the Reichstag and then concentrated on the few hundred meters to Führer headquarters against fierce resistance. General Monke's SS troops and the remnants of our 56th Panzer Corps were defending the bunker valiantly. Even though their own deaths could be the only possible result of their continuing to fight, still they fought on. At about 7 p.m., an aide of General Krebs arrived with an order for Weidling to come with a small working staff to Führer headquarters. Whatever that might mean, it was a change, and there was hardly anything now that could make things worse. Weidling decided to take von Duffing, a clerk, and a liaison officer along. I was to stand by and follow the next morning at the latest, with the latest situation map. At around 6 a.m. on May 1st, Major Kirsch, our liaison officer with General Monke, arrived from Führer headquarters. He reported very strange things. Incredibly, Weidling was apparently being held there against his will, under something like house arrest. I took my maps and set out again on the horrible trip to Vossstrasse, as Weidling had instructed me before he left. In the conference room of the Chief of the General Staff of the Army, I met Weidling, von Duffing, and the others from our staff. Weidling somehow looked completely different. Something had happened that had thrown this man, who could not be discouraged even in the most hopeless situation in battle, completely out of kilter. Weidling informed me quietly that Goebbels had told him last night that Hitler, after first marrying Eva Braun, had taken poison together with his wife and shot himself. None of us had known about Eva Braun before, but now it occurred to me that she must have been among the women in the bunker whom I took to be secretaries. The corpses were rolled in carpets, drenched with gasoline, and burned in the courtyard of the Reich Chancellery, so that they would not fall into the hands of the Russians' Goebbels had Weidling come to the bunker so he could continue leading his troops from there. I was stunned. For some reason, it had never occurred to me that Hitler would commit suicide. If he planned to commit suicide, why had he not done it long ago, when it was obvious that the war was lost? Why had so many people had to die so senselessly, right up to the moment the Russians were knocking on the bunker door? Such selfishness was unbelievable to me. Goebbels, as the highest Reich minister in Berlin, had taken command, and apparently was afraid that Weidling might take action on his own. Weidling told me that he was not free to leave the bunker and advised me to try to maintain my base at Bendlerstrasse, so I would not be restricted to the bunker as well. He said he would try to get the agreement for the breakout tonight. He told me that the night before, von Duffing and Krebs had gone to the Russians to explore the conditions for a surrender. Both spoke Russian. But the Russians had insisted on unconditional surrender. Von Duffing then told me the details about his trip across the front lines. After Hitler's death, Krebs had immediately got in touch with the Russian command by radio and asked whether a German delegation could cross at Wilhelmstrasse to talk to them. Krebs, who was a former military attaché in Moscow, walked with von Duffing along Wilhelmstrasse, partly through the subway tunnel. They were received by Russian officers and driven to General Chuikov's staff headquarters. Although their conduct was correct, the Russians were adamant in their demand for unconditional surrender and for extradition of Hitler, whose death was not yet known to them, Goebbels and all other non-soldiers responsible for the war. The next morning, Krebs gave his consent to begin the breakout during the night of May 1st. Weidling gave Refior the order to issue the code name to our divisions. It was now too late for a massed, centrally led breakout in one direction, so breakouts were to be made individually by each division, beginning at 9:30 p.m. Weidling also gave each division commander and each soldier the choice to either join the breakout action or to go into Russian captivity. In talking with General Major Monke, Weidling and I learned that SS Brigade Monke intended to leave at about 9:30 p.m., gather at the subway station at Friedrichstrasse, and break out in a northerly direction. Weidling decided that our corps staff would join this group, and he instructed me to have our corps staff personnel ready to leave Bendlerstrasse at 8 p.m. We would, of course, have to fight our way through to the Reich Chancellery in order to join Monke's group. The Reich Chancellery personnel, or those who were left, also intended to join this group. Krebs and Bergdorf decided to stay and take their own lives. During my walks through the Reich Chancellery this day, I saw wounded people everywhere who were being cared for by Army medical corpsmen and by Red Cross nurses. SS men were helping themselves to such delicacies as canned sausages and soda or beer. It was obvious that the end had finally arrived. Plans were being made now by individuals rather than by commanders. At 7:30 p.m. I sat down to a last supper with all those from Hitler's immediate entourage who were still present in the Führer bunker. I was probably the only outsider in the group. Sitting around a large table with me were Martin Bormann, Admiral Voss, a liaison officer representing Admiral Dönitz, Ambassador Hewell, a liaison officer representing Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop, and 4 or 5 women whose identities I do not recall but who must have been secretaries. There were also 2 or 3 other people. We had tea, army bread, corned beef and canned liverwurst. The conversation, of course, was about the forthcoming breakout through the Russian lines. Since I was an experienced combat officer and therefore an expert in this group, I was bombarded with all kinds of questions. The appearance of the group was unusual, because all were dressed for the breakout. Fat Bormann could hardly have been comfortable in the regulation enlisted man's uniform he wore. The Admiral and the Ambassador also wore enlisted men's uniforms. Even the women were dressed in army uniforms. The attitude of the women was fatalistic. Whatever happened could not be helped. Hitler was dead, and that was almost more of a shock than they could handle. They had all been with him for many years, and their minds were probably now blank with the inability to cope with what was happening. During this meal, at about 8 p.m., Dr. Goebbels came in with Frau Goebbels to say goodbye to the Reich Chancellery staff. One of the secretaries whispered to me that Goebbels's children, who had still been running around in the bunker in the afternoon, had already been put to death. The attitude of Frau Goebbels was very composed under the circumstances, and Dr. Goebbels also showed an amazing composure. It seemed astonishing to me that they could come around and calmly say goodbye to everyone, knowing what they had just done and what was to come next. They were in control of their emotions, however, and their voices sounded firm. With solemn expressions, they wished everyone luck for the future. They shook hands with everyone, and then without apparent emotion they turned around and walked back through the hallway toward the Reich Propaganda Ministry to take their own lives there. Although Weidling had made arrangements to break out with Brigadier Monke, he wanted to go back again to Bendlerstrasse to address the staff and give everybody the choice of breaking out or surrendering. It was still daylight. The Russians had already taken the Reichstag and were throwing everything they had against the Reich Chancellery. The Tiergarten was now the centre of the battle, and we were subjected to targeted artillery fire, machine gun fire, and small arms fire. I did not wait for Weidling, because 2 men would just present a bigger target than 1. We had no protection, and it would have been pointless to fire back with our puny little pistols. The best thing to do was to concentrate on being a small, quick target and reaching the next cover alive. I jumped from cover to cover swiftly. Weidling, who was twice my age, could not move as quickly. This extremely dangerous and physically exhausting trip, together with the events of the past 24 hours, must have finished off Weidling's nerves. He might alest have been influenced by von Duving's report about being treated correctly by the Russians. In any case, in the bunker at Bendlerstrasse, Weidling declared that he did not want to break out, but to surrender to the Russians instead. I told him I would like to take my leave, since I did not want to surrender, but, according to the arrangements we had made earlier, would rather take part in the breakout with Brigade Mohnke. Weidling turned on me in a terrible outburst of fury. This was the only time he ever became angry at me, apparently because he felt that I had deserted him on the return from Führer headquarters, although he did not say that directly. But he certainly had no right to accuse a soldier who had survived as much combat and been wounded as many times as I had of cowardice, and I told him so in rather explicit terms. We were probably both on the verge of nervous collapse. The human system can only take so much, and certainly we had put our systems to the test. Perhaps he took my desire to break out as a reproach, since he had told Mohnke an hour earlier that he would join him with his entire staff. Of course, we would have suffered losses getting to the Reich Chancellery, but most of us would have made it. In any case, he forbade me to leave the bunker before 10 p.m. Until then, according to him, he still needed me. But of course it would be too late for me to join the Mohnke group then. So with his order, Weidling sealed my fate and prevented me from trying to escape Russian captivity. I was still soldier enough to follow orders instead of deserting to try to break out on my own, although anger raged inside me. There was still work to do, preparation for the surrender, burning of all our papers and files, the official diary of the 56th Panzer Corps and Major Wolf's personnel files, orders to surrender to all units that could still be reached. After von Duving gave a brief speech about his decent treatment by the Russians the night before, almost all the members of the staff were in agreement to surrender without further fighting and to become prisoners of war of the Russians. The exact orders for the surrender and the march into captivity would be rendered after von Duving negotiated again directly with the Russians. It did not take long to establish radio contact. At midnight, von Duving would be picked up as intermediary at the Bendler Bridge. He was to ask for the honourable surrender of our troops, an immediate ceasefire, the protection of civilians against terrorism, each soldier's right to keep food and personal belongings, and the right of officers and men to remain with their units. In the courtyard, fires were burning with all papers and the files of the Supreme Command of the Army. I was especially sorry that all the personnel files went up in flames, because I had always taken great pride in my military record. But the years of being a professional soldier were now over. When von Duving returned from talking to the Russians, Weidling called all the staff together and told them that arrangements had been made for us to surrender the next morning. I wrote a letter to Lilo and addressed copies of it to various relatives, since I could not know who might still be alive. I gave the letters to several women, signal auxiliaries and Red Cross nurses, for whom the Russians had promised unimpeded travel. Then, for the last time, I ate a meal prepared by my orderly, tender green beans, boiled ham and fried potatoes. I also had 2 glasses of champagne. To be on the safe side, my orderly filled my haversack with food and my canteen with cognac. I then carefully took inventory of my personal things in order to decide what I might need most as a prisoner of war. The biggest question was whether to take my sleeping bag or my fur-lined overcoat. With my previous experiences with the cold winters in Russia firmly in my memory, the fur coat prevailed, even though summer had hardly begun. I exchanged my tailored uniform for a regulation uniform, because it would not call attention to me and would be more comfortable. I pulled a pair of tanker's coveralls over that to cover the red General Staff stripes on my pants in case they should prove to be a liability. My best shirts and underwear, some food, my photographs and letters, and a few packs of cigarettes for barter completed my luggage. In spite of my throwing away a great many things, my knapsack must still have weighed over 30 pounds. And on top of that, my heavy fur-lined uniform overcoat. But if necessary, I could always throw some things away later. Of course, there was no thought of any sleep now. I had slept during artillery bombardments, and I had slept knowing that attack was imminent, but now the uncertainty of what lay ahead drove sleep away. I wandered outside into the Berlin night. The mild spring night contrasted with the flaming ruins around us. An almost ghostly silence lay about us. It seemed almost tangible after the constant noise of battle during the past few weeks. As I surveyed the ruins around me, the question, at what cost, ran through my mind. The cost of this war had been far beyond the capacity of mere humans to tabulate. Did I feel in any way responsible for it on this night? Did I feel any moral guilt? Not yet, although it was to come later, when I learned much that I did not know on this night. For now, I regretted only that we had lost the war, and my first priority was surviving what lay immediately ahead of me. 1,000 questions about my destiny went through my head in the early darkness of that Berlin night. What would my new life as a prisoner of war of the Russian army be like if I were not shot? How long would captivity last? How would it end? I knew that when we had recaptured German towns from the Russians, we often learned that they had murdered the German officers they had captured. I felt that I had to assume that my life was now over and I would be shot. The biggest question was how things were at home. Had everyone survived the fighting in Leipzig? This question provoked another, more and more urgent. Should I try to avoid captivity? Should I now clamber on my own through the ruins and try to get home? I thought of the possibility of hiding in the rubble, taking enough to eat and drink to last several days until things quieted down, and then trying to escape to Leipzig. But I knew the Russians would be looking for people doing that. I was familiar with the ring of Russian forces around Berlin, and as the operations officer during the defence of Berlin, I knew the bottlenecks that had been created by the blown-up bridges everywhere. I knew, without any doubt, that there was no chance of my leaving Berlin without being caught. I drew my pistol from its holster, disassembled it, and threw the pieces as far as I could in different directions. I did not want it to become a souvenir for some Russian soldier. This symbolic act was my final resignation and surrender. I stood in the darkness and listened in amazement to the warbling of some thrushes nearby. I had not heard such sounds for so long, and it seemed incredible that they could have survived the final battle. It was spring, and the thrushes would be preparing to raise a new generation of themselves. Could there possibly be rebirth after such total destruction? In my present state of mind, I could not believe it. In any case, my world had ended. Soon dawn came, and we had to swallow the bitter pill of surrender to the Russians. At 5:55 a.m. on May 2nd, 1945, our arms were stacked and everyone was in marching formation in a grey Berlin drizzle. We were Weidling's corps staff and a number of communications people, radio and telephone technicians, who had remained at Bendlerstrasse when the headquarters of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces moved out of Berlin. Devastation lay all about us. Much of the city was still burning in the drizzling rain, and the acrid smoke sharply assaulted our nostrils and eyes. Weidling had already gone by car to the Russian General Chuikov's headquarters near Tempelhof Airport. I busied myself getting the troops into formation and making sure that none had weapons. Oberst von Dufing, Oberst Refior, Major Wolf and I led the column to the end of Bendlerstrasse, about a half-block away, where the Russians were waiting for us on the far side of the Landwehr Canal. The canal was about 100 feet wide, with steep cement banks on each side. It had been used to move barges through the city. The bridge across the canal had been destroyed, but a huge bundle of cable that had been strung across the canal underneath the bridge was still intact. There were telephone and electric cables, thick cables, thin cables, cables of all different colours that went into the ground on each side of the canal. General Vasily Chuikov. Approximately 3 feet in diameter, the bundle of cables, all tied together, formed a workable footbridge, and the ranking Russian officer crossed it to our side. Von Dufing saluted and reported to him. The Russian officer spoke to von Dufing and then returned to the other side of the canal. About 24 Russian soldiers with submachine guns waited on the other side of the canal, along with several American-made jeeps. Our column crossed the bundle of cables, walking upright in single file. When I stepped onto the other side of the canal, I thought of it as the symbolic end of my life. The Russian soldiers with submachine guns all had big grins on their faces when we reached the other side. One of them said, "Hitler kaput," and they all giggled gleefully. They were enjoying their victory hugely, as any victorious soldiers would. Von Dufing talked to the Russian officer briefly, and then told Refior, Wolf and me that we were to be taken to General Chuikov's headquarters about 3 kilometers away. First, however, we drove only a few blocks to a Russian division headquarters, where we were put on display and looked over with a great deal of curiosity by the division staff. General Chuikov's headquarters was in a side street near Tempelhof Airport, in an upper-middle-class neighbourhood. Chuikov's headquarters was on the first floor of a large apartment building that had been built around the turn of the century. Some younger Russian officers led us through a corridor to a large room where General Weidling was awaiting us, and von Dufing reported the orderly surrender at the bridge. Finally, Chuikov's chief of staff came in, and a few minutes later Chuikov entered the room. We saluted, and he returned our salute. Chuikov instructed General Weidling to compose a written order instructing those German soldiers in the city who were still resisting to stop fighting. A German typewriter was brought in, and I typed Weidling's order as he dictated it. The Russian writer Ilya Ehrenberg incorrectly reported in an article I read later that a blonde female secretary typed the order, "I was blonde but male, and a major in the general staff." I made several carbon copies at the directions of the Russians, and Weidling signed them all. The Russians kept one copy and gave the rest to Wolf and me. Weidling, von Dufing, and Refior were then invited to join the Russians in a big breakfast feast at Chuikov's headquarters, while Major Wolf and I delivered General Weidling's order to the still resisting German troops. The feast was apparently a victory celebration. I am sure Weidling, von Dufing, and Refior had no stomach for it, but they were hardly in a position to refuse the invitation. I went in one of the American-made jeeps with a Russian captain to a Russian Corps headquarters and then to a division headquarters. At both places I was gazed at with great curiosity,